The bell tower tolls under a gray medieval sky. The sound rolls across the cloistered walls of a convent, carried on the damp morning air. To the outside world, this is a sanctuary of piety and peace, a place where holy women devote themselves to prayer, humility, and service. But behind the iron-banded doors, a different story sometimes unfolds. A story of power, control, and hidden abuse. This is not the medieval history written in gilded manuscripts or illuminated prayer books. This is the history whispered through locked corridors, the treatment of women labeled as fallen, and the secret suffering of those who were supposed to be untouchable, the nuns. Long before our modern notions of freedom, reputation was a fragile coin. In the cities and villages of medieval Europe, a woman's honor was everything. If it was tarnished, whether by rumor, by poverty, or by the unwanted attention of powerful men, society branded her as dishonored. And dishonored women had few places to turn. Convents, in theory, were supposed to protect them. Yet the very institutions meant to guard chastity sometimes became prisons of humiliation. The convent was not just a place of prayer. It was a social machine, where noble families sent daughters they could not afford to marry off, where widows sought refuge, and where women accused of immorality were locked away in the name of salvation. Life inside the cloister was harsh. Nuns followed the rule: silence, fasting, and endless hours of prayer. Their lives were meant to be a living sacrifice. But sacrifice often turned into suffering when the convent became a dumping ground for inconvenient women. Imagine the novice, a young girl barely in her teens, her head shaved as she entered the cloister. She might never have chosen this life, but her family decided it for her. The veil was not always a symbol of devotion. For some, it was a sentence. Priors and abbesses ruled with absolute authority. Discipline could be severe. A nun who spoke out of turn, or even looked out a window without permission, could be confined to a cold cell for days on bread and water. Records from medieval visitations, the church's own inspections, describe punishments for disobedience that sound more like something from a prison than a holy retreat. But discipline was only part of the story. Power attracts corruption. Bishops, priests, and local lords often saw convents as places where they could exert influence, and sometimes take liberties. When nuns tried to resist, they had no recourse. The very vow of obedience that bound them to the church also silenced them. Outside the convent walls, women accused of promiscuity or prostitution faced a different kind of punishment. In medieval cities, morality was policed not only by church authorities but by civic law. Fallen women could be paraded through the streets, forced to wear shameful clothing, or branded with marks that told the world they were disgraced. Some cities had designated stews or red light districts where such women were confined. Others banished them entirely. But for many, the convent became a place of forced repentance. Bishops sometimes ordered prostitutes or unmarried mothers to enter religious houses, not to live holy lives, but to be contained and re-educated. This was not kindness, it was control. The church believed that by locking women away, dressing them in coarse robes, and subjecting them to strict discipline, their sins could be burned out like impurities in a furnace. We know from surviving records that these women were often treated harshly. They were separated from the choir nuns, forced to do menial labor, and given fewer rations. Some were never allowed to leave even after years of penance. They became invisible, erased from public life, hidden behind walls that were said to protect their souls. The greatest tragedy came when those entrusted with guiding these women exploited them instead. Chronicles and court records tell of priests who used their authority to enter convents, supposedly to hear confessions, but in reality to prey on the vulnerable. Visitation records from France, England, and Italy reveal shocking stories. In some cases, abbesses complained to bishops about priests who harassed or even assaulted nuns. In others, entire convents were accused of loose living, though often these accusations came from male clerics who were themselves the source of the corruption. The scandal of the convent of San Zaccaria in Venice, the troubles at Fontevraud in France, or the infamous visitations of Bishop Alnwick in 15th century England, these accounts show a pattern of unchecked power. Nuns who spoke up risked severe punishment or expulsion. The church often buried such scandals quickly to avoid public shame. And what about the women inside? They were silenced. Some bore children in secret, children who were quietly spirited away or left at church doors. Others vanished into confinement, locked in cells not for their sins, but for someone else's. Medieval people believed deeply in visible penance. If a woman was accused of misconduct, whether a nun caught speaking to a man or a laywoman accused of adultery, she might be forced to stand barefoot at the church door during Mass wearing sackcloth with ashes on her head. Everyone would see. Everyone would know. In convents, penance could take other forms. A sister might be ordered to prostrate herself before the entire community, confessing supposed pride or disobedience. In more severe cases, she could be flogged during chapter meetings, where all the nuns gathered to read the rule and confess their faults. The same mentality extended outside the convent. Public shaming was a tool used to control women's behavior. Prostitutes were sometimes forced to wear striped clothing or bells on their sleeves, so everyone could recognize them. In German cities, they were paraded with shaved heads. In England, some were whipped at the town cross. These punishments were meant to warn others. Step outside the narrow line of approved behavior, and you will pay in flesh and in honor. Not all was silence. Occasionally, brave women spoke out. Letters survive from nuns begging for intervention, pleading with bishops, popes, or kings to protect them from abusive superiors or predatory confessors. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent III received complaints about convents where discipline had broken down, not because of unruly nuns, but because of corrupt priests who visited them at night. In the Low Countries, mystic writers like Mechthild of Magdeburg hinted at the dangers women faced inside religious life, cloaking their warnings in visions and allegories. Some reformers, horrified by what they found, tried to clean up the system. New orders like the Poor Clares sought stricter enclosure to protect women from outside interference, but that protection sometimes turned into an even deeper prison. Behind the chants of psalms and the sound of tolling bells, a quiet reality pulsed through these cloisters. Women who wanted to serve God, or who were forced to wear his habit, could become pawns in games of power, lust, and control. When we imagine medieval nuns, we often picture serene figures illuminated by candlelight, copying manuscripts or tending gardens. But many lived lives of fear under watchful eyes. Some convents truly were havens of learning and prayer, where holy women cultivated deep spirituality and charity. But others became cages. The abuse of nuns and fallen women was not just personal. It reflected the broader medieval view of women as weak, needing control, and easily led astray. Society believed that strict discipline would keep them pure. In reality, it often left them defenseless against those who had no intention of being pure themselves. The stones of those old convent walls still stand in Europe today. If they could speak, they would tell stories of whispered prayers and silent tears. Whispers ran down the cloister halls, not of prayer but of warnings. Stay silent. Do not be noticed. Do not anger the wrong man. For medieval nuns, the veil promised peace and purpose, yet often became a prison. The walls of a convent were meant to shield holy women from worldly sin. But what happens when danger comes not from outside, but from within those very walls? In many medieval cities, convents were wealthy institutions holding lands, rents, and privileges. Such power drew the attention of bishops, nobles, and kings. When a convent resisted control, when an abbess refused to hand over revenue or bow to secular authority, punishment could be ruthless. Some leaders were accused of scandalous behavior simply to justify stripping them of power. Royal inspectors arrived under the pretense of reform, but the real goal was domination. Letters from the 13th and 14th centuries reveal chilling stories. In one case, an abbess who refused to yield land to a local lord was paraded through the town on foot, forced to wear a humiliating sign around her neck, "Disobedient nun." In another, reform commissions locked rebellious sisters in dark cells for months, claiming they needed penitence. Even well-connected nuns could not always escape. The very church that promised sanctuary sometimes became the instrument of coercion. And what of those women branded as fallen? Prostitutes, or merely women who defied the social order, were often punished alongside errant nuns, their fates intertwined in the machinery of shame. City authorities staged brutal public displays to remind everyone a woman's body was not her own. In Paris, Florence, and London, records tell of women marched bareheaded through markets, wearing rough wool or chains, jeered at by crowds. Their hair was shorn, not as simple grooming, but as a mark of dishonor. In some cases, they were whipped not to destroy flesh but to destroy dignity. The point was never only justice. It was control. A 15th-century Germantown chronicle recounts an especially haunting tale. A young woman, barely 20, was accused of wandering at night without license. She may have been a maid seeking bread, or a girl simply in the wrong street at the wrong hour. The town council ordered her to stand at the church door during Sunday Mass, wearing an iron collar fixed with a bell so everyone would see her shame. For an hour, she endured the stares of neighbors, priests, and strangers. A living sermon about obedience. Inside convent walls, similar tools of punishment existed. Some abbesses used penitential garb, coarse wool tunics, crowns of thorns, even iron chains, to discipline sisters suspected of vanity or secret disobedience. Officially, these were spiritual corrections. In practice, they kept women silent, frightened, and dependent. A nun who questioned her confessor or resisted his demands risked being labeled a temptress, a sinner, or even possessed. Few dared speak out. One rare voice that did was that of Clare of Rimini, a 14th-century holy woman who denounced corrupt priests for exploiting female penitents. She described how women who sought spiritual guidance were manipulated, threatened, and even starved into compliance. Clare herself faced slander and exile. Her story survived only because sympathetic chroniclers believed her holiness outweighed the accusations. The theme repeats across Europe: power cloaked in piety, authority hiding behind the language of salvation. Women who stepped outside prescribed roles, whether prostitutes in the street or nuns behind cloistered gates, became targets for public lesson-making. And yet, many resisted in quiet ways. Some runaway nuns sought refuge in distant towns, disguising themselves as servants. Some fallen women formed sisterhoods, creating houses of repentance where they could live outside the control of brutal magistrates. Others found protectors among sympathetic clergy or noble patrons. Their courage often went unrecorded, but it existed. Not all abuse came from overt violence. Often it was slow suffocation. Convents were sometimes denied food shipments until sisters obeyed reforms. Women under suspicion were forbidden to speak to visitors, write letters, or even walk freely in the gardens. Inquisitors asked questions meant not to discover truth, but to break the will. A nun who hesitated, stammered, or wept could be accused of lying, her fear used as evidence against her. These tactics echoed the treatment of other marginalized women, prostitutes, widows, and unmarried daughters, whose independence threatened the order of medieval society. City statutes reveal how tightly this control was woven into law. In Venice, Florence, and Cologne, authorities passed ordinances requiring prostitutes to wear striped veils, colored ribbons, or bells on their shoes. The idea was to mark them forever, even when they tried to disappear into the crowd. Such laws stripped women of privacy and dignity, branding them as living warnings. Meanwhile, convent visitations forced nuns to confess even the smallest faults. A laugh too loud, a glance too long at a visiting priest, as if their humanity itself were sinful. The underlying message was clear. Women were to be watched, corrected, and displayed as examples. Whether holy or profane, silent or defiant, they were never fully free. Control of women's bodies and reputations reinforced the authority of men, bishops, magistrates, and kings, in both church and state. Yet even in these dark chapters, glimmers of resistance shone through. Some abbesses wrote letters directly to the Pope, bypassing local bishops who sought to dominate them. Others smuggled messages through loyal lay servants. In towns, sympathetic neighbors sometimes hid fallen women to protect them from public whipping or banishment. And in a few extraordinary cases, the shame rituals backfired. When a beloved local woman was paraded in chains, Crowds jeered not at her but at the officials, forcing them to end the spectacle early. By the late Middle Ages, voices calling for reform grew louder. Thinkers like Christine de Pizan defended women's honor and criticized the hypocrisy of those who condemned them while committing sins themselves. Some city councils began replacing corporal punishment with fines or house arrest, recognizing, reluctantly, that public cruelty bred resentment. Convents, too, saw waves of genuine reform, led by devout women determined to restore spiritual discipline without abuse. But the shadow of fear never fully vanished. The stories of abused nuns and shamed women remind us that medieval society used punishment not merely to enforce law, but to shape behavior and belief. By humiliating a few, authorities sought to control many. These spectacles of degradation were theater as much as justice, warning every woman of her place in a rigid hierarchy. And the echoes of those lessons, about obedience, silence, and fear, lingered long after the punishments ended. Today, the records that survive, trial transcripts, visitation reports, city decrees, speak with a cold, bureaucratic voice. They list names, crimes, and sentences as if these women were nothing more than statistics. But behind every name was a life. A nun who once dreamed of peace, a girl who wandered too far after dusk, a mother forced into the streets by hunger. Their pain was real, even when the chroniclers dismissed it as necessary discipline. When we walk through the ruins of medieval convents, or gaze at paintings of solemn veiled women, it's easy to imagine serenity. But the silence of stone walls can hide many things. They can hide whispered prayers of courage, yes, but also muffled cries for help. The past was not a single story of holiness or corruption, but a tangled web of faith, power, and fear. And perhaps the darkest truth of all is this: many of these punishments were justified not as cruelty, but as love. Officials claimed to save women's souls by breaking their spirits. Bishops spoke of correction, magistrates of public order, confessors of guiding the erring. In their minds, they were healers, not tyrants. That is what made the system so enduring and so dangerous. By remembering these women, the veiled and the unveiled, the cloistered and the condemned, we honor more than their suffering. We honor their humanity. They lived in a world determined to make them symbols of sin or sanctity, when in truth they were neither. They were human beings, deserving of dignity, who endured an age that too often denied it.